Chapter 4 Hauser's Wood. The farther west Brock and I drove, the more that heavy layer of storm clouds disintegrated into light balls of cotton, between which blue skies and sunlight could find their way. Brock's mood was also improving. "When do you want to move your stuff in?" he asked. "Whenever," I replied. "I'm ready." I'm embarrassed to admit it, but I had been living in my parents' house since I left my job at Media Pimps. Yeah, I know, I'm a stereotypical nerd, but I did save a lot of money, and also I don't care about your opinion. "Let me help you finish cleaning out the first room when we get back." "I will not say no to that. You can find a way to evict the cockroaches. Oh, and I'll put you to work scrubbing crusty yellow stains off the walls. That'll just about make up for having me drive into a tornado today." "Jesus, it's that bad?" Brock laughed. "It's worse, actually. You'll want to bring a HEPA filter mask." "You better slow down," I told Brock, and pointed to a green Department of Transportation sign that let us know we were entering Daleville, a town famous for nothing but being a speed trap. Daleville has one cop, and his main job is writing tickets to anyone caught going faster than 35 miles per hour. The money from the tickets props up the town council, which is comprised of 5 men who are all blood-related in some way. I've been told the money gets funneled back into meth and various real estate scams. Could be just lies and rumors perpetuated by people who get stopped and ticketed, but I tend to believe it. You can only hear these stories so many times, you know. Indiana cities and towns don't generally announce their population numbers, but I'd guess this place couldn't have been home to more than about 500 people. In my secondary school days, I attended Broadacre High, go fighting stag beetles, which was part of the Salamone Consolidated School District. All these tiny map specks and rural areas fed into the same area high school, which serviced the entire county, and during my whole 4 years I think I met a grand total of 2 people who claimed to hail from Daleville. It just isn't a place where young families with kids live. In fact, it's really more of a place where old farmers go to die. Everyone in this town seems to be over the age of 60. There's no industry to speak of. A couple of antiquated grain elevators were still in operation at an agricultural co-op on the outskirts of town. Farther down the road, we passed through a traditional Main Street area with about 90% of its storefronts boarded up. Of the businesses still in operation, one was Gurley's Place, which sounds like a strip club, but was actually just a small mom-and-pop cafe. Trust me, I went in to check once and left disappointed. The other was Kevin's Auto Body. It probably should have been called Kevin's Used and Busted Tire Sales, judging from the tall stacks of both that Kevin was storing in his parking lot. The whole strip looked like it was attacked in a war long ago and had never recovered. A cloud of dreariness was just hanging over everything. I saw the faded remains of advertisements painted on brick walls. Obviously, this was a functioning community at some point. I imagined farmers in overalls rubbing elbows with men in brown suits and fedoras, everyone tipping hats to ladies in swirling dresses as they strolled down the sidewalks. Old cars parked along the curb. Before that, horses and buggies, probably. Now there was no one. Some remnants of the old closed-down businesses remained. One sign, of the type sponsored by a soft drink company that I won't mention, think red and white, read Nickerson Drugs. Another, a hand-painted wooden marquee, read simply, Feed and Grain. Apparently there was once a bookstore and a lawyer here too, but all those signs hung above windows that were shattered, dark, boarded, or all three. It wasn't much of a stretch to realize that once the last of the current generation of residents died off, this place was going to be a ghost town. Even at just 30 miles per hour, Brock drove even slower than the posted speed limit to make absolutely sure that we didn't get pulled over, and with good reason. We did catch Officer Billy Bob sitting in his squad car, radar gunning from behind an overgrown fence row. It only took about 2 minutes to drive clean through Daleville and get back out into open country. Now fields of winter wheat spread from the road to the north and south. The wheat, a low carpet of light green, was back into its growing period after a time of dormancy during the long Indiana cold season. We could see far off to lines of trees at the backs of the fields, informal boundaries that divided one farmer's property from another. Most people think of Indiana as an overwhelmingly flat place, ground down by glaciers during the last ice age, to a perfect uniform height. But there are elevation changes, subtle hills and depressions, inclinations and low spots, even as parts of what you might otherwise consider to be completely level fields. You just have to look a little more closely and adjust your perspective. All of a sudden, I saw the landmark I was looking for, and we were about to miss the turn. "That's it," I said urgently, pointing to an old concrete surveying obelisk marking a gravel road. Brock was going way too fast. I grabbed the car's "oh shit" handle and braced my feet against the floorboard under the dash as Brock expertly pumped the brakes and took the turn at about 40 miles per hour. It felt like we were going to tip over, skidding as the truck left the pavement and sprayed gravel. Brock whipped the wheel the other way to straighten us out as he was jostled forward and back. "Yeehaw!" he shouted. He was definitely feeling better now. I've noticed that sometimes after a panic attack, his emotions swing all the way in the other direction. I think all the adrenaline from his anxiety gives him a natural high for a bit. Once it became clear that we weren't going to flip over and explode, I let myself laugh. "Nicely done, you cock." Ahead, the road disappeared into a dark wood. "I do prefer a little bit of advance notice, man," he said. "Okay, 3/4 of a mile now." I had to yell to be heard over the roar of tires on gravel. "There will be a dirt road on the left. Come to a stop after you turn, though. It's chained off." Everything dimmed as the truck entered the woods. I tried to look ahead for the turnoff, but saw nothing other than green haze in every direction, occasionally splotched with yellow sunlight. Eventually we found the overgrown but navigable opening between two large trees. Brock turned in and squealed to a halt, our progress blocked by a red and rusty chain strung between metal eyes, screwed right into the trees themselves. I grabbed my bag of supplies and dug around behind the seat for the pair of 12-inch bolt cutters that I knew Brock kept somewhere in his tool chest. Brock was already out of the truck, eyeing a sign hanging from the chain that read, "No trespassing." "I get the impression we're not supposed to be here," he said. They just don't want cars driving back this way, unless there's a funeral." "Looks like there hasn't been a funeral for a long time." Two shallow ruts running down the center of the muddy road were being slowly erased by weeds and erosion. "Probably not since the late 70s, I said, jumping the chain. "It's fine. We aren't messing anything up. We're just looking around." Brock looked unsure but followed. We walked on reverently, as though idle talk would disturb some kind of long-dead spirits of the woods. The air was humid. It was still sprinkling a bit, even though the sun was out. I could hear drops pattering on the trees above us. It felt great to be outside on a Friday afternoon, a work day, far away from busy streets and office buildings and coworkers who never shut up about reality television, doing something a little risky, a little out of the ordinary. Ahead was a clearing and a 10-foot security fence. Much of it was nearly opaque from the twisted vines that had woven themselves like tentacles through the chain links. The woods itself seemed to be trying to pull down the ugly and out-of-place man-made work, reclaiming its natural space. Inside the fence, through a wide gate that had apparently been opened fairly recently and was free of growth, but chained and padlocked, we could see a much older wall constructed of rough stones and mortar. An opening in that wall was flanked by worn columns and topped with an arched iron sign that read, "Hauser's Wood Cemetery." The O's were both missing. I held out the bolt cutters to Brock. He shook his head. "Nope. I'll let you be the lawbreaker today." I shrugged and headed for the thick brush next to the fence. I couldn't find an easy passage, so I took a deep breath, dropped to my hands and knees, and pushed my way in. "Keep an eye out," I called. The growth was thick enough here that I probably wouldn't be seen, even if someone did happen to drive up, but I didn't want to take any chances. I started cutting a hole in the fence, near the ground, and quickly found that it was going to be a lot more difficult than I had anticipated. The short-handled bolt cutters were easy to hide in a deep pocket or backpack, but didn't offer much leverage, and I really had to lean in with some power to snip the metal. After just a few cuts, my palms were red and burning, the beginnings of some major blisters. I really wished I'd remembered to bring gloves, but kept at it. Snip, snip. My forearms were starting to ache from squeezing the cutter. Snip. The humidity wasn't helping either. Sweat was running down my face and into my eyes, forcing me to stop every few seconds to wipe away the stinging salt. Snip, snip. I took another look at my hands. Pale, juicy blisters were racing across the middle of my palms. I took off my shirt and wrapped it around one hand. Snip. The impromptu bandage helped somewhat with the pain in my hands, but now the brush I was crouching in was raking its thorns and sharp, claw-like branches down my bare back and arms, opening long cuts. Snip, 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 snip. I had 3/4 of a hole finished when the pain became too intense to continue. Gingerly peeling the shirt away from my hand, I found that one of the blisters had popped, and clear liquid was running out. I looked at my work. I was so close. With my other hand, I grabbed the fence flap that I was cutting on and bent it backward, pushing it through. Good enough. I had a semicircular hole at the base, about 2 feet in diameter. I put my shirt back on and lay on the ground. After a bit of contortion and wriggling, as well as puncturing myself a couple of times on the jagged chain-link edges, I was through, finally. I rested for a moment on soft grass, panting, then started to poke and prod my wounds to assess the damage. The worst cuts weren't too deep, the others were just scratches. I wiped the blood on my khakis. Thank God for second-hand clothes, I thought. If these get ruined, I can just drop $3 to get another pair. When I appeared on the other side of the gate, Brock's expression told me that I must have looked pretty bad. Watch out for the thorns, I said nonchalantly. A moment later, he was through. I tore my shirt. Brock's polo had a long rip down the back, but other than being dirty, he didn't seem otherwise worse for wear. Wow, look at this place, he said. We walked through the stone gate together. It didn't look anything like a typical cemetery with sculpted hills, freshly mown grass, and carefully organized rows of headstones. Hauser's wood had been desecrated and forgotten. Other than a few bare patches here and there, spindly trees and waist-high grasses had grown into every available space, hissing softly in the wind. A large tree had fallen nearby, splintered from its trunk about 10 feet from the ground, probably the result of a lightning strike. Everything was so wild and overgrown that it was impossible to get any sense of the depth or boundaries of the plot. It didn't look much like a cemetery at all, as no headstones were immediately visible, only a couple of rough paths trampled through the weeds that led away to unknown destinations. "Where are all the graves?" Brock asked. "So here's the deal," I said. I had done my research on the internet in the week leading up to this trip, reading as much as I could on the stories and folklore of this cemetery. The headstones are either missing, or they're under all these weeds. I set off down one of the dirt trails. Why are the headstones missing? The cemetery has been abandoned for decades. Since the 70s, people have been coming out to get drunk, have sex, maybe do a little devil worship or whatever. Fun times. People have reported seeing mutilated animal corpses. Anyway, kids move the stones around, steal them for souvenirs. Or there's a pond at the back of the property. I think a lot of the stones ended up in there. Look at this. Brock moved some weeds aside to expose a thick, squat monument. Except the ones like this that are too heavy to lift. We continued down the path as it turned and crooked without any apparent logic. I couldn't help but picture hundreds of sleeping corpses in coffins 6 feet below the surface. Were we walking on someone's final resting place? It was impossible to know, and it didn't seem right. Believe it or not, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, people used to have picnics here, I said. Creepy. Back then people didn't look at death the same way we do now. They saw it a lot more often. They took care of their own dead. It didn't seem as morbid as it does to us. I'm glad I live in the 21st century. We passed another grave marker that seemed haphazardly placed on its own with no relation to any of the others. William Egan, a child's grave. Kid was 5 years old. Died in 1963. I stopped and stared, trying to imagine what this place looked like decades ago when funerals were still being held. Trim grass, willowy trees, a park-like atmosphere. A gray day of swollen clouds pissing on the assembled mourners. The women all looked like Jackie Kennedy, bouffants and pillbox hats, black veils covering faces, dabbing at eyes with silk handkerchiefs. The men, stoic in their dark suits and heavy-rimmed glasses, skinny ties, and wavy hair full of pomade melted by the rain, watched as the pallbearers pulled a tiny coffin from the back of a hearse. My images of 60s fashion come from vinyl album covers. That's about all I know of it. Fat droplets pounded open black umbrellas. A murmur that resolved into weeping drifted up from the crowd while funeral home representatives watched dispassionately. It was their duty to remain stolid during such a solemn occasion. Or maybe they were just ready to get things over with and go home. Regardless, they held their chins high near the stone cemetery entrance and ushered the procession inside. There was no chain-link fence surrounding the property. There was no need for one. The cemetery was looked upon with pride by the community and immaculately maintained. No one would have thought of vandalizing monuments with people coming and going, visiting the deceased, spreading their blankets on a grassy hill to enjoy lunch in the company of their loved ones. The kid's final journey was nearing its end. As the coffin was carried through the archway, light thunder could be heard rumbling in the distance. Doesn't it always rain during a funeral? A tent had been erected near the open grave. Families sat in a row of chairs, other mourners stood behind them. The pallbearers set the coffin onto a device for lowering it into the ground. I blinked back to reality when a large, lichen-crusted obelisk caught my attention. It looked familiar. I recognized the angle of its leaning from pictures. "If I remember right," I said, "this one is a popular attraction." "Doty," Brock read. The words in the stone, though weathered, were still visible. It was apparent that this grave had been visited often. Frequent footfalls had created a dirt track all the way around the stone. "This is where the infant daughter is buried." I followed the path to the back of the Doty tombstone and found a much smaller slab leaning against it. Scattered everywhere were moldy plush toys, plastic trinkets, coins, and the occasional folded scrap of soggy paper. The stone read simply, "Infant daughter." No other words, names, or dates had been inscribed. "Sad," said Brock. "She didn't even have a name." Probably why every idiot who comes out here has to leave an offering. At least they don't steal the stone. I picked up one of the notes and tried to read it, but it was old and the rains had rendered the link illegible. You can see why this place has a reputation for being haunted. "Yeah," Brock said. "Why isn't anyone taking care of it?" I took a deep breath. Well, cemeteries are just like any other business. They have to make money, even if it's just to keep the grass cut. This one wasn't selling enough plots anymore. Then the last proprietor died, sometime in the 60s. I guess he tried to leave it to the town of Daleville, and they didn't want it, didn't have the money for it. So it fell to the bottom of the priority list. Brock thought for a minute. "You'd think relatives of the people who are buried here would try to find a way to keep it up." "There might not be any living relatives left. Every once in a while, someone at the local government level says, 'Hey, shouldn't we fix up Hauser's wood?' But it never happens. So it just sits here." "Basically. Once the grass gets tall, people think it's abandoned. Then they vandalize, throw the stones in the lake, dig up the graves, whatever. Costs even more to fix up then." Brock was distracted by a chattering squirrel and didn't see me do it, but I took a small toy, a plastic ballerina, from my shopping bag and left it on top of the infant daughter marker. Then I walked back to the main trail. Brock picked out a stick and started thrashing at the tall grass. "People really dig up the graves?" Brock asked. "A couple of times in the 70s, I guess. I found some newspaper scans online." We continued to walk single file with Brock in the lead now, into a dark corner of the cemetery nestled in the shade of mature oaks. A few scattered drops of rain were still falling, but the skies were mostly clear. This whole place was like a maze. We were deep enough into the woods that it was no longer possible to see the entrance in the stone wall. Occasionally a smaller path would branch off from the larger one. I was really hoping that we'd be able to find our way out of here when the time came. Brock continued to hack away at the weeds like Hernan Cortez cutting his way through the jungle with a machete. "Somewhere around here there should be another famous tombstone," I said. "There was a picture taken around 1986 of a ghost girl sitting on it. kind of translucent and wearing a flapper dress. Translucent girls are the best kind. Where is she? Said Brock. Maybe she smelled us. I caught a whiff of myself on the breeze, and it wasn't pleasant. Crack! Brock's stick struck stone hard. Half of it broke off and went flying into the distance. Found something, he said. I helped him tamp down the weeds around an ancient block of stone, about 2 feet tall and engraved with a crosshatch pattern. This is it, I said. Where's the name? Brock was examining the stone from all sides. I wiped the slick sweat from my forehead with the back of my arm. This is just the base, I said. The actual monument is long gone. I pulled a disposable camera out of my shopping bag and handed it to Brock. Can you get my picture? I brushed a layer of loose dirt from the stone, a fairly pointless move since I was already filthy, and sat down. Remembering the position of the ghost girl in the photograph, I attempted to contort myself in the same way. I stretched my legs out straight and rested my palms on my knees. My back was straight, my chin was slightly raised. I tried to look despairing. Brock tipped the camera out of its box and ripped off the foil seal. He wound the film until the indicator showed the number 1 in a little plastic bubble. Am I sitting on her lap? I called. Hold that pose. Brock was holding down a button to charge the flash. My back was starting to cramp from sitting in such an awkward position. Probably from crouching in that brush for so long while I cut through the fence, too. Hurry it up, my back hurts. Patience, man. Brock was looking through the viewfinder and trying to frame the image. Suddenly, he stopped. His mouth hung open. He sucked in a sharp breath. His finger hovered over the shutter button. Oh my God. I flew up off that stone like my legs were touching a hot car hood in the summer. Heart stopped. I spun to look, simultaneously leaping several feet away. I heard the camera snap. There was nothing there. Then Brock started to laugh. Not funny, I yelled, running at him. He was cracking up. He took off down the trail. Oh, it really was. I stopped and sat down cross-legged to let my pounding heart slow. He got me good, I had to admit. I can't wait until you see your expression in that picture, immortalized. Brock walked back toward me. I shook my head and spit. Okay, that counts as your payback for the tornado thing, I said. I don't know, man. We'll see. Brock stuck out a hand and pulled me to my feet, still laughing. We continued down the path, passing a few smaller headstones with dates ranging from the 1840s to the 1920s. The grasses and weeds began to thin out, and we were headed down a gentle incline. It seemed that we were hundreds of miles from any kind of civilization, outcasts and exiles from the upstanding citizens of the world, who mowed lawns and paid bills on their days off. An invisible bird whistled brightly from the trees overhead. After a period of silence that I judged to be just about long enough to express my annoyance with Brock's prank, I spoke. Do you know the story about the farmer? I know that's what a lot of people claim to see out here. So in the early 1900s, there was a farmer working the land with a horse-drawn plow, I said. Apparently, the horse got spooked by something and dragged the farmer and the plow right into a deep pond. The horse and the farmer both drowned. Since then, a lot of people have heard horse noises at night or seen an old man in a straw hat and overalls wandering around. Horse noises. Neighing, whinnying, whatever. Brock pondered this for a second. Hang on. There are gravestones here from the mid-1800s. So this was still a cemetery back then. Why was the farmer plowing in a cemetery? Yeah, there's the rub. And why didn't the farmer just let go of the plow when they went into the water? Maybe he was tangled up in the rains. I don't know. You're thinking too much. It ruins the story. Brock laughed. So where's this pond? We've been walking forever. I pointed. We're there. It's the boundary at the west end of the cemetery. We could see a bright clearing ahead. The wooded area was opening into a pleasant glade at the edge of a small body of water thick with green algae. There were a number of low headstones here, orderly, laid out in neat rows. This place looked almost presentable compared to the rest of the cemetery. The grass was short. The pond seemed specifically designed to draw the eye into a pleasing vista to the dense forest on the other side. There was even a small stone mausoleum, in classical Greek style, perched atop the bank. Brock and I froze at the same instant. As we surveyed the scene, our eyes lighted upon something our minds couldn't decipher. Something that should not be. A woman, dressed all in black. A high-collared Victorian dress. White gloves, bare feet. Illuminated from behind, golden rays of sun bursting from her edges. She was standing on a concrete step in front of the mausoleum, looking out over the pond. Brock and I said nothing. It never occurred to us to move. We could only stare. The woman turned, slowly, impossibly, as though she were a weight dangling from a string. She looked right at us. Her eyes in shadow felt like empty black holes. Everything was quiet. My muscles were tight, ready to run, my eyes never leaving the unreasonable figure. Then, to my horror, Brock stupidly shouted, "Hello!" The woman raised her arm in a slow, sweeping wave. Brock began to walk cautiously in her direction. "Are you a ghost?" "Boogity boogity," she replied. She laughed and shook her head of dark curls. I was stuck in the mud. It seemed to require superhuman effort to raise my feet, either to approach in curiosity, or to turn my back on this potential threat and loose the coiled springs of my muscles, running like I'd never run before. I could only watch silently, waiting for the moment she would turn into a hideous demon, crab crawling around the cemetery and spewing bile. If she's going to swallow Brock's soul, I thought, he's on his own. Brock reached her and shook the hand she proffered. She seemed solid enough. They appeared to be talking, but I couldn't make out what they were saying. After a few moments, Brock motioned urgently for me to join them. Suddenly, I felt silly. I pulled up my roots and ambled towards them. As I approached, I could see that she was really more of a girl than a woman, maybe a teenager. And she was indeed wearing an old-fashioned dress with puffy sleeves that tapered at the elbows. Lying on the ground near the mausoleum door were a pair of leather ankle boots that laced up the front through about 100 eyelets. Hi?" I said. "I'm not going to bite your neck," the girl replied calmly. She held out a gloved hand. "What the hell?" "Zane, be nice," Brock said. "Wisteria? This is Zane. Zane, Wisteria." "Charmed," Wisteria said. "What the hell?" I repeated. "I didn't mean to scare you." "Why are you wearing that?" I asked. "Why shouldn't I?" she sniffed. "I wear what I like." "In a cemetery?" I was screeching now. I didn't even care. "Where else am I going to wear my Victorian morning dress?" She smiled and offered her hand again. I gave up and shook it. She wasn't ugly. She wasn't beautiful either. Her face was very round and a spray of freckles dotted her flat nose. She didn't appear to be wearing any makeup. Her dark hair was parted down the middle and flowed into a cascade of unruly curls that ended a few inches below each ear. The most interesting features of her otherwise plain face were large brown eyes that appeared simultaneously surprised and piercing. Suddenly she grabbed my arm and rotated the underside up to her view. "Jesus," she said. "Did you guys get attacked on the way here?" "Attacked by greenery," Brock said. He turned around to show her the gash in the back of his shirt. Had to cut a hole in the fence. "So, how... We got here after you. There was no hole when we got here." I was babbling. It was getting hard to organize my thoughts again. "How long were you... Well, how did you get in here?" Wisteria made a big show of yawning. "If you go around to the north side of the cemetery and walk back a little ways, there's a place where a big tree fell on the fence and knocked it down flat. You can walk right in." Brock laughed. I didn't. "Are you guys like ghost hunters?" Wisteria's eyes shone. "You really thought I was a ghost, didn't you?" "Zane doesn't believe in ghosts," Brock said. Nope, I just have a vivid imagination. I have evidence to the contrary. Brock held the disposable camera. I snatched it out of his hand. He was about to piss himself. I stuffed the camera back into my bag and looked at Wisteria. So, my question, you didn't really answer. It's really not really a normal thing, right? For someone to be out in a cemetery prancing around in a, whatever you're wearing. Wisteria looked hurt. I told you, I wear what I like. I have a lot of costumes. Weird. Not a good idea. It's not your cemetery. Brock was giving me a let it go sort of look. So how did you get out here? He asked. I don't see your car. I rode my bike. To a cemetery, I said. Wisteria sighed. It's a nice place to sit and draw. People used to have picnics here, you know. I know. Anyways, what are you guys doing here? Looking for some action and adventure, Brock said. And rubbings, grave rubbings. All the stones are gone. Well, most of the stones, not too many left. We were going to do some grave rubbings, but all the stones are gone. Most of them. My face was getting red. I just wanted to punch myself in the head. Brock thought I was embarrassing myself, I could tell. Wisteria bounded through the cemetery in her bare feet, skipping around to the front of a thin, plain monument. Do this one, she said excitedly. I've never been able to read it. It's so worn. I followed her and opened the shopping bag, took out a piece of tracing paper, and unfolded it. Brock helped me tape the sheet to the front of the tombstone. Reaching into the bag again, I withdrew a stick of charcoal. Using a few light strokes, I rubbed the long edge of the charcoal piece over the paper until an image began to form. A hand, with index finger pointing to heaven, encircled with leaves. Then a name. Bernadette Freeland, and some text. Wife of Josiah Freeland. Below that the date read, January 15th, 1843 through August 16th, 1857. Wait, said Brock, she was somebody's wife? She was only 14. I laughed nervously. Josiah was a pedophile? Do this one, said Wisteria, flitting about and pointing to a neighboring stone. More. Hang on a sec. There's more at the bottom. I adjusted the paper and continued the rubbing. Sweet child, thou hast soared from earth, took with her our joy and mirth. Thou wilt one guardian angel be until I rise to dwell with thee. Wisteria stared at the epitaph, lost in thought. I left the first sheet taped in place and moved to the next gravestone where Brock had considerately set up for me. This rubbing revealed the image of an open book, below which the name Josiah Freeland appeared. July 7th, 1841 through December 24th, 1907. No poem on this one, Brock said. He stood up. Wonder if he ever remarried. There aren't any other stones here. Maybe that Bernadette girl. She could have died in childbirth, I mused. She was the youngest child, said Wisteria slowly. She was drawing out her words, almost moaning them. A shiver ran through me. She had some kind of fatal disease. Her playmates weren't allowed to come see her anymore. Not even her best friend Josiah, who lived next door. All she could do was lie on her bed and read her storybooks. Brock and I looked at each other confused, but didn't interrupt. The oldest sister in the family was getting married, and Bernadette's parents carried her out of the house so she could see the ceremony, even though the doctors advised against it. They were simple farmers, but they had saved enough for a fairy tale wedding. It was so beautiful. Her brothers built a huge gazebo and painted the house and barn white so everything would match. They strung light, gauzy fabric on poles and stretched it to the ground to make sheer tents for the guests. Candles, they set them up everywhere and had torches flickering out in the yard. People came for miles around because, It was Indiana in the 1800s, and there weren't a whole lot of social events going on. So people showed up for everything, and it was perfect. Bernadette couldn't move, but she watched the people crying and laughing and dancing. And Josiah came up and talked to her even though he wasn't supposed to. They talked about all the things they used to do before she got sick. They would climb trees and play that old game where you roll the hoop with a stick and chase the goats around. She told Josiah that she wanted to get married just like her sister before she died. So he proposed to her. Her parents thought it was silly and they didn't want to go along with it, but it's hard to refuse a little girl's dying wish. So they dressed her up in a nice white dress, and Josiah wore his Sunday suit. The minister came and performed a little ceremony, and Bernadette was happy. Josiah went home. He found out the next day that Bernadette had died during the night, and swore that he would never remarry. And he never did. He thought of Bernadette as his wife for as long as he lived. It's said that on moonless nights, you can come to the cemetery and see Bernadette and Josiah playing together. A quiet moment passed. Brock blinked. How do you know all that? I don't, Wisteria said. I just made it up. See how easy it is to start urban legends? Brock snorted. You're okay, Wisteria. I carefully pulled the rubbings from the gravestones and folded them neatly. Have you guys had enough action and adventure for today? She asked. Or would you like to see the inside of an old scary farmhouse? I said. Brock shrugged. Sounds like fun. Do you have a car? Wisteria replied. It's a pickup, actually. Even better, let me get my bike. Wisteria skipped over to the mausoleum and pulled open the heavy door. What are we doing? I hissed at Brock. Brock threw his hands up in the air. No idea, man. Relax. Wisteria came out of the mausoleum with a lime green, vintage model Schwinn. She picked up her boots and threw them into a basket attached to the front of the bike. It was decorated with a couple of purple plastic daisies. I called out to Wisteria. Before we got here, what were you doing in there? Were you in that old mausoleum? It was raining. The door was open. Want to see? Brock and I couldn't really contain our curiosity. Wisteria held the door open for us as we peeked inside from the front step. It was dark, but a colorful square stained glass window at the rear let in enough light to get an idea of the mausoleum's contents once our eyes adjusted. There were real caskets, stacked 3 high, in rows along the walls. Dry leaves stirred in the wind. Someone had written KKK and Illuminati on a wall and casket with orange spray paint. You can go in if you want, Wisteria offered. No thanks, I said. How long were you in there? I don't know. Maybe half an hour. I wasn't scared. It was nice to have a roof over my head. Obviously, this girl was crazy. I mean, I liked creepy stuff, but waiting out a thunderstorm inside a dark crypt with dead bodies would just never occur to me as being an option. I'd rather get soaked. I was kind of hoping that she'd lose interest in us and leave on her own. Brock was looking into her bike basket. Her boots were lying on top of a sketch pad. He pointed. Can I see? Wisteria nodded. Not my best work, she said, but it kept me busy while I was waiting. Brock flipped through the notebook. She had made quite a few pencil sketches of the inside of the mausoleum, the cemetery, the pond. She wasn't a great artist, I could tell. Brock turned a page and I could see a scribbled list with people in need written at the top. She snatched the pad out of his hand before any more of the words could register. That's private, she said. Sorry. It's okay. Shall we be off? Brock looked down at her bare feet. She wasn't wearing any nail polish. You want to put your shoes on first? She shook her head and set off, wheeling her bike down a trail that Brock and I hadn't noticed before. Nah, my boots were expensive. I don't want to get them muddy. Her long dress rustled as she walked. We'll go out the easy way. I'll show you guys where the fence is down, and then if you want to come back, you won't have to crawl through a hole." "How often do you come out here?" Brock asked. "I'm sure you have this idea that I'm some kind of morbid goth type and that I sleep in the cemetery or something, but really I don't. I've only been out here a few times. It's peaceful." Soon we reached the north edge of the cemetery, and she was right. A large tree had fallen on the security fence there and knocked it flat. We stepped over and followed a narrow path back toward Brock's truck. "I hope my boyfriend won't be jealous that I'm hanging out with two older guys," she teased. "What do you guys do for a living?" Brock and I looked at each other. He spoke for both of us. He hesitated. "We're self-employed." Wisteria raised her eyebrows. "And what is your industry?" "We're cleaning out the house of a dead hoarder." Wisteria nodded. I don't think my boyfriend will be too worried." Brock snorted. "What do you do?" "I'm taking a gap year." "What's that?" Brock asked. "I graduated from high school last year. I'll be starting college this fall. I'm taking a year off in between to figure out what I want to do with my life." "Oh, good. So you're a bum, too," Brock said with a grin. "I'm finding myself," she replied. We had reached Brock's pickup. Brock climbed in while I helped Wisteria put her bike in the bed, making sure she didn't drop it on top of my metal detector. Then I heard a vehicle approaching. It was a police car. "Uh-oh," I said. "Brock, you might want to get out here." Where did I leave the bolt cutter? I thought with a start. I hadn't carried it out of the cemetery with us. And were there fingerprints on it? Probably. It's under the bush where I hacked through the fence. Not good. I could just see one side of the bright orange handle lying in the grass a couple 100 feet off. "Don't look at it," I told myself, trying to put on a nonchalant expression and failing at it. Daleville Police was stenciled on the side of the cruiser. It pulled up behind the truck, intentionally blocking us in. A slender, severe-looking officer climbed out. He was wearing those stereotypical mirrored cop sunglasses and had a narrow face with a pointed chin. Brock read his badge. "Officer Harlan?" "You guys are trespassing. You're not supposed to be here," he said. Authority figures tended to make my social anxiety even worse, so I let the others do the talking. "We were just leaving," said Wisteria. "Have you been in the cemetery?" "Nope." She shook her head. I thought about the bolt cutter again, then remembered the notepad full of cemetery sketches in Wisteria's bike basket. If the cops saw those, we were so screwed. "I need to see some ID." Brock and I took our driver's licenses out of our wallets and handed them over for him to study. Wisteria said, "I didn't bring mine. I rode my bike here." "What's your name?" the cop asked her without looking away from our IDs. "Wisteria Hackett." Something about that name caught his attention, and he finally glanced up, scrutinizing her face. "Robert Hackett's daughter?" She nodded. He seemed to frown at her as he handed back our licenses, probably questioning her sanity with that choice of dress. "I'm taking your names down. I don't want to catch you back here. This is off limits." We all nodded profusely. "If I do find you around here again, there will be trouble. Am I understood?" More nodding. "Go home," he said, and climbed back into his squad car. We complied, and quickly. I was afraid to even roll my eyes, lest he see and our semi-miraculous reprieve be spoiled. Wisteria called shotgun, and since Brock was driving, that meant I had to ride in the bitch seat with legs astride the gearshift lever. This day was really starting to take a turn for the worse. At least when I turned around to look out the back window, the cop had gone and wasn't planning to follow us. "Well, okay then," Brock said. "Where are we headed?" "Do you know how to get to North Broadacre?" Wisteria asked. Her puffed sleeve was tickling my face. I smashed it down. Brock thought for a moment. "That's the new town across the river, right?" "It's not really a town. It's a housing development. Still part of Broadacre. They just liked the name. But yes, she replied. North Broadacre, though, isn't that all, you know, recent construction? I said. It is, mostly, but it was built on the site of an older abandoned town, and they haven't knocked all of it down yet. Sounds good to me, Brock said. I shifted uncomfortably in my seat and said nothing. Brock wheeled the truck around and headed back out onto the road.